Forbidden Love, Deadly Secrets. The tragic end of a Dubai affair, true crime, a hook, a secret affair, a deadly betrayal. One man's life is shattered in the heart of Dubai. But who's really in control? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking twist you won't see coming. The hotel room smelled like expensive cologne. The curtains hung still, blocking the sun. Ahmed, a successful businessman in his late 40s, sat by the window, his fingers drumming against the glass. His heart raced. He wasn't used to this feeling. Nervousness. The door creaked open. Layla stepped inside, wearing a black dress that shimmered in the low light. She smiled at him, but her eyes were different. Cold, calculated. Her heels clicked against the marble floor. The sound echoed in the quiet room. She approached him slowly. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Ahmed's throat tightened. He had never been sure. Not really, but it was too late. He stood and turned toward her. The moment their hands met, a flash of heat ran through him. But there was something else in her touch, something darker. The world outside the window felt distant, unreal. Dubai, a city of lights and gold, seemed far away. Inside, everything was closing in. They sat down, their eyes locked. But something was wrong. Layla's smile was too wide, her eyes too sharp. It was like she was playing a game, but Ahmed didn't know the rules. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The tension thickened. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak. "What's happening?" he muttered. Layla didn't answer. She only stared at him, unmoving. A loud knock on the door made both of them jump. Ahmed froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. A second knock came, louder this time. His heart pounded in his chest. Layla didn't move. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. He felt a chill down his spine. Was she involved? Another knock, more urgent this time. He rushed to the door, but his hands were shaking. When he opened it, no one was there. He glanced down. A small envelope lay at his feet. He bent down and picked it up. The paper was thick, luxurious. His name was written in bold, black ink. He tore it open. Inside was a single sentence. "You are being watched." The words on the paper burned in his hands. His heart skipped a beat. He turned, but Layla had vanished. The room felt colder now, as if the walls were closing in on him. He scanned every corner, but she was gone. Had she ever been there? The envelope dropped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. Ahmed's breath quickened. The sudden silence was suffocating. He moved towards the window, pulling the curtains aside. The city sprawled out beneath him, unaware of the chaos unfolding in the room. A distant car horn echoed, but it felt muffled, like a sound from another world. His mind raced. He hadn't heard her leave. Had she been waiting for something? For someone? A loud bang suddenly shattered the silence. The sound of a door slamming somewhere far away. Ahmed's pulse spiked. His body froze, but his thoughts spiraled. He wasn't alone in this hotel. Someone was watching. The weight of the envelope's words pressed down on him. He turned quickly, his back to the window. His hands gripped the edge of the desk as he tried to steady himself. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, more ominous. Something wasn't right. Then he heard it. A whisper, soft but distinct, coming from behind him. "Ahmed." He whipped around, but the room was empty. The silence returned. His breath was ragged now, his chest tight. He moved toward the door, pulling it open slowly. But the hallway was dark, too. A figure stepped into view, just beyond the edge of the light. A man, tall, broad-shouldered. His face was hidden in shadow. Ahmed's heart nearly stopped. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped closer, the soft sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights returned, The man was gone. But something else remained. A note, crumpled on the floor. It read, "Run. It's too late for you." Ahmed's pulse raced as he stared at the crumpled note on the floor. His breath shallow. His mind screamed at him to move, to run. But his feet were rooted to the ground. What was happening? Who were these people? He glanced around, looking for a way out. The hotel corridor stretched in both directions, dark and silent. But the feeling of eyes on him was unmistakable. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. His hands trembled as he bent down to pick up the note. The paper was smooth, almost too smooth for a simple message. Something about it felt off. He crumbled it back into a ball and stuffed it in his pocket. Then he bolted for the stairwell. His feet pounded against the stairs as he descended. He didn't dare use the elevator. The weight in his chest only grew heavier with each step. A sharp pain shot through his side, but he kept running. He couldn't stop now. Not after the note. Not after that man. He reached the bottom floor and skidded to a stop. The lobby was eerily quiet. The usual buzz of activity was absent, like the world had been paused just for him. He scanned the room, every corner. Then he spotted something, a glimmer, a reflection in the glass. A woman, her face barely visible, but he knew it was Layla. She was watching him from across the lobby, her expression unreadable. And this time it wasn't the same. Her eyes were cold, empty. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't want to face her. Not now. Not like this. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the door slammed shut. A forceful crash, and then he heard it, a voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't have run." Ahmed's heart stopped. He turned slowly. Layla wasn't the only one in the lobby anymore. The man from the hallway stood there too. And he wasn't alone. The figures closing in on him felt like ghosts, but they were too real, too alive. Ahmed's legs wobbled as he tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The shadows swallowed him whole. Ahmed's breath caught in his throat. The room was closing in, suffocating him. The man in the lobby stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. Layla's cold eyes never left his face. The others, 3 more men, emerged from the darkness, circling him like predators. He stumbled backward, his body shaking. "What do you want?" he choked out. The man in the front, the leader, didn't answer right away. He just looked at Ahmed, his gaze calculating, deliberate. The tension thickened, suffocating. Layla finally spoke, her voice soft, almost tender. "You never should have come here, Ahmed." Her words felt like a dagger in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of his heart pounding in his ears. The leader stepped closer. "You're a man who made the wrong choices. Now you pay the price." Ahmed's mind raced. What had he done? How had it come to this? But the truth was clear. It wasn't just the affair with Layla. It was the secrets, the lies, the things he'd thought he could control. And now they were coming for him. He looked around, frantic, but the men were closing in. There was no escape, no way out. His eyes locked with Layla's. Her face was unreadable, but in the depths of her gaze, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Regret. Or was it pity? Too late now. One of the men lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar. "Please," Ahmed gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. But the man's grip tightened. The cold, empty silence in the room felt suffocating. Layla didn't move. She just watched. The leader nodded, and the other men stepped forward. The finality of their movements struck him like a punch. There was no hope, no mercy. As one of the men raised his hand, the glint of a knife catching the dim light, Ahmed's world went black. The last thing he felt was the cold steel against his skin. The sharp pain sliced through him like fire. But it was quick, almost numb. A sickening weight settled over his chest as he crumpled to the floor. The world around him spun, his vision blurred. He could barely hear the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Layla's face, hauntingly calm, lingered in his mind, her eyes still watching him from the corner of the room. But there was no time for that now. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the cold marble beneath him. The darkness crept in. His pulse slowed. The faint echo of distant voices seemed so far away now. He tried to call out, but his throat was too dry, his breath too shallow. His body refused to move. The room, once so full of tension, now felt like an empty, cold void. He could barely make sense of what was happening. The pain in his side was the only thing keeping him tethered to the reality around him. But it was fading. He felt the life drain from him slowly. And then, a sharp sound broke through the fog. The flicker of a phone screen lighting up in the corner of the room. A soft beep. A message. The phone, Layla's phone, was abandoned on the floor near the desk. A message from an unknown number. Ahmed's blurred vision barely registered it, but the words sent a chill down his spine. You thought you could escape, but we've always been watching. You're not the first. He tried to lift his hand, to reach for it, to understand, but his fingers wouldn't respond. The darkness swallowed him whole. Outside, the bright lights of Dubai gleamed, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in that silent hotel room. A moment of betrayal, a life lost, and the secret still hidden in the shadows. There was no one left to hear the truth now. The silence stretched long, as if the world had forgotten him. His body lay still on the cold marble, lifeless. Outside, the lights of Dubai flickered, distant and cold. But within the room, a quiet movement broke the stillness. Layla returned. She stepped in, her steps slow, deliberate. She glanced at him, her eyes unreadable, as if she were looking at a puzzle she had already solved. For a moment, she stood there, watching the aftermath, the finality of it all. She didn't seem to feel the weight of it. She didn't seem to feel anything. Layla walked past his body, toward the window. The glass reflected her image, but there was something about it. Something detached. The city lights outside mirrored the emptiness in her eyes. Her phone buzzed again, the sound sharp against the quiet. She glanced at the screen. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. She typed something quickly, her fingers moving with practiced ease. Her expression shifted, but only slightly. The message sent. With a calm sigh, Layla turned away from the window. She looked at Ahmed one last time. Time for the next step, she murmured to herself, almost as if the dead man in front of her wasn't a person at all. He was just a part of a game. A piece moved. The door to the room creaked open once more, and two figures entered. They were silent. Their presence felt like a shadow looming. Layla didn't flinch. She simply nodded. The figures moved with precision, gathering the evidence, clearing the room. Their movements were practiced, efficient, cold. They worked quickly. The bloodstains on the marble, the phone on the floor, the crumpled notes, everything would disappear. And just like that, the room would be empty again. The only trace left of Ahmed would be a story, whispered in the dark corners of the city, a story of a man who thought he could escape the consequences. Layla turned once more, glancing back at the body on the floor. For a moment, a flicker of something passed through her eyes, something almost human, but it was gone before she could fully grasp it. She stepped out of the room, leaving the darkness behind. And just like that, the final chapter closed. Layla's footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into the distance. Behind her, the room remained eerily quiet. The faint hum of air conditioning was the only sound left. In the corner of the room, the blood-stained marble floor reflected the dim light from the flickering lamp above. But it wasn't just the physical traces that remained. There was a weight in the air, like something had been broken, and it couldn't be fixed. The figures in the room moved like shadows. They cleaned up the mess, erasing every trace of what had happened. No one would know. No one would question. Layla had made sure of that. But in the back of her mind, a thought lingered, something she couldn't shake off. The mission was almost over. Almost. She turned one last time, glancing back at the room, as if trying to seal the memory away forever. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Everything is taken care of." It was one of the men who had entered after her. "Yes," she replied softly, her tone as cold as ever. He nodded, his face unreadable. "And the message?" he asked. "Sent," she said, the slightest hint of satisfaction in her voice. Another man emerged from the shadows, holding a thick folder. He handed it to Layla. Inside, photographs. Her eyes scanned them quickly. Her fingers brushed over the images, cold, methodical. The faces of people, rich, powerful, influential. People who had no idea they were being watched. Layla's lips curled into a slight, dangerous smile. Her game was far from over. She wasn't done yet. Ahmed had been a pawn, a small piece in a much larger puzzle. She closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. As she turned to leave, the last thing she saw before stepping into the hallway was the man's body, now nothing more than a forgotten casualty. She felt no remorse, no hesitation, just a steady, calculating resolve. The world outside, the city of Dubai, hummed on. And she, too, would continue, for there were always more to play, always more secrets to uncover, and always more lives to destroy. The heavy doors of the hotel lobby closed behind her with a soft thud. Layla stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of the glimmering city outside. Dubai's skyline stretched before her, sharp and cold against the night sky. The lights flickered like stars in the distance, indifferent to the death she had just left behind. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket, the screen lighting up with a new message. A single sentence. Time to move to the next phase. Layla's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, her thoughts calculating, precise. Without hesitation, she tapped a few keys. A second message went out. Her work wasn't over, not by a long shot. She wasn't just running errands, cleaning up after someone else's mess. No, she was a part of something far bigger, a shadowed network of power, manipulation, and secrecy. She had become a key player in a game that spanned continents, with invisible hands pulling the strings. The people she worked for, they didn't leave loose ends. Ahmed's death? A necessary sacrifice. He had become a threat, a weak link in a chain that had to be broken. Layla adjusted her coat and walked toward the car, waiting for her outside. The driver didn't look at her as she slid into the back seat. He knew better. She settled into the plush leather seat, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The city lights blurred as the car pulled away from the hotel, vanishing into the night. She had no idea where her journey would lead next, but wherever it was, she would be ready. In this world, there was no room for weakness, no space for hesitation. The pieces on the board moved in ways no one could predict, but Layla understood it better than anyone. She had already won, and now the game was hers to control. The car sped into the dark streets, disappearing into the depths of Dubai's labyrinth. In the silence of the night, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint buzzing of a phone in her pocket. A new message already waiting, and she smiled. The phone buzzed again. Layla's fingers gripped it tightly as she read the new message. Get to the safe house. They're starting to ask questions. A cold shiver ran through her, but she hid it well. She tapped a response, her fingers moving like a machine. On my way. Her gaze remained focused on the dark road ahead, the headlights cutting through the night. The driver didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where to go. The streets of Dubai blurred past them, the towering buildings now just silhouettes against the moonlit sky. But Layla's mind was far away, racing through the possibilities. The people who had been watching her were close now. Too close. She felt it. The weight of being watched, the pressure of knowing that every move she made was being tracked. And yet, she remained calm. She had always remained calm. She had no choice. Layla's life had been nothing but careful steps, hidden agendas, and carefully laid out plans. And now, the consequences of her actions were beginning to catch up with her. But there was no turning back, no regrets. She glanced out the window, the bright lights of the city flickering in the distance. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Remember, we're always 2 steps ahead. Don't make a move until we say. She nodded to herself, though no one could see it. 2 steps ahead. That was always the key. And she would keep moving, keep planning, keep controlling. The car slowed as it turned onto a quiet side street, the lights dimming. The safe house was nearby. Layla's heart rate slowed, her mind sharpening, her focus narrowing. As the car pulled to a stop, the doors opened. The driver didn't wait for her to step out. He was already gone, disappearing into the night. Layla stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. The safe house loomed in front of her, a nondescript building with no sign of what lay inside. She approached the door, her fingers brushing over the cold, steel surface. Her hand hovered over the doorbell. Then she pressed it. A moment passed. The door creaked open. A man stood there, his face unreadable. "Come in," he said, his voice low. Layla stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. She was no longer just a player. She was the game. The air inside the safe house was thick with tension. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls, making everything feel more oppressive. Layla stepped further into the room, her eyes quickly scanning the space. It was empty except for a few chairs, a desk, and a collection of monitors along one wall, all glowing with the faint, steady light of surveillance footage. The man who had opened the door remained silent as he watched her, his posture rigid, like a guard awaiting orders. Layla didn't speak immediately. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. She walked toward the desk, where a man was sitting, his back to her. His fingers were moving rapidly over a keyboard, his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't look up as she approached. The tension in the room seemed to grow with every passing second. Finally, the man at the desk turned his chair slowly, his face finally coming into view. His expression was hard, calculating, his eyes cold. "Layla," he said, his voice measured, "you've made a lot of progress, but it seems you've stirred something bigger than we expected." She met his gaze unfazed. "I've handled bigger problems before," she replied, her voice calm but firm. The man leaned back in his chair, assessing her, as if weighing her worth in that moment. "You might be good at keeping things under control," he said, "but there are forces at play now that even you can't control." Layla didn't flinch. "I don't need to control everything. I just need to stay ahead." The man's lips twitched into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that," he muttered, before turning back to the monitors. The sound of the keys clicking again filled the room, the rhythm almost mechanical. Layla stood still, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just a warning. This was a test. The game had changed. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her as the realization hit. There were bigger players in this game, players who would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. And now they were after her. She turned away from the desk and approached the wall of monitors. Each one showed different locations, public spaces, private residences, and hidden corners of the world. She scanned the images, her mind working quickly to piece together the puzzle. Something was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed again. The message was short, blunt. They know. Her heart skipped a beat. The weight of those words settled in. She turned back to the man at the desk, her face unreadable now. They know, she repeated softly, more to herself than to him. The man didn't look up, but the atmosphere in the room shifted. The game now was no longer just about control. It was about survival. Layla's hand drifted to her side, where she had concealed a small, cold object, a backup plan just in case things went wrong. And things were going wrong. It was time to move, time to disappear. Before they closed in, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, her steps swift but deliberate. The man at the desk didn't stop her, but his eyes, still locked on the screens, watched her leave. Layla stepped back into the cold night air, her heart steady, her mind already racing ahead to the next move. The pieces were shifting, but she had always known how to adapt. She had always known how to stay ahead. The cool night air hit Layla's skin as she stepped back into the darkness of the city. The safe house was behind her now, and her mind was already spinning with possibilities, calculating her next move. The message had been clear. They know. It was no longer a question of if they'd catch her. It was when. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it quickly. A new message. A single word. *run*. Layla's pulse quickened. The tone was urgent. She had no time to waste. The streets of Dubai, usually filled with life, felt suffocating now. The shadows seemed to close in on her, and she knew it wasn't just the darkness. There were eyes watching, invisible but omnipresent. She reached for the small, concealed weapon at her side. A small, sleek device she had learned to trust more than people. It was her lifeline. In a world of lies, betrayal, and constant danger, it was the only thing she could count on. She moved swiftly through the narrow alleys, trying to keep her steps quiet. Every corner, every shadow felt like a threat. Her instincts were sharp, but even she knew when she was outmatched. And tonight, something told her that whoever was after her wasn't playing by the same rules. She turned a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. A car was parked at the end of the street. Its headlights flickered on. Someone was waiting for her. The cold grip of panic tried to claw its way into her chest, but Layla shoved it down. She had trained for moments like this. Stay calm. Stay focused, The car's engine hummed to life, and it began to roll slowly towards her. Layla didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the alley to her left, her breath coming in sharp bursts, her mind working through escape routes. But before she could make it more than a few steps, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Footsteps that were too close. Layla froze. Her mind raced. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. The man from the safe house. The one who had been watching her closely. He was closing in, a cold, knowing look in his eyes. She had run long enough. Now, it was time to face what she had been avoiding all along. That Layla's breath was ragged as she turned to face the man. The alley was tight, claustrophobic, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The footsteps behind her had stopped, but the presence of the man, silent, unblinking, was unmistakable. He stood still, a few feet away, as if waiting for her to make the first move. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a mere coincidence. She had been tracked, cornered. "I knew you'd run," he said softly, his voice carrying an eerie calm. Layla stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the thrum of panic beginning to pulse in her veins, but she fought it down. There was no time for fear now. There was only action. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not what I want, Layla. It's what's already been decided." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. She knew what they meant. The game was over. A shiver ran down her spine as she glanced around. The alley was narrowing. The night seemed to close in around her, thick and suffocating. She had no escape. For the first time, she felt truly trapped. But there was one thing she had left, one card she hadn't played yet. Without warning, she reached into her jacket and pulled out the small device, the one she'd kept hidden in case the moment ever came. She pressed a button, activating the signal. The man's eyes flickered to the device, his expression changing ever so slightly. For a fleeting second, Layla saw the hesitation in his eyes, and that was all she needed. The ground shook beneath her as the sound of distant sirens grew louder. A van sped around the corner, screeching to a halt. Men in tactical gear spilled out, surrounding the alley. The man's eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. Layla stepped back, her face a mask of resolve, as the team closed in. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was in control. The game had shifted. She had played her final move, and she walked away, leaving the shadows behind her.